Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the West of England's webinar today. The fuel, as a way of a short introduction, by the FuelEU Maritime Regulation is a very well-published piece of EU legislation that affects shipping, and it forms, of course, one of the cornerstones of the EU's Fit for 55 ambition, and also part of the EU's goal to reach climate neutrality by 2050. And of course, we've got COP29 going on at the moment in Azerbaijan. So there is a lot of focus, and quite rightly so, on emissions and the environment generally. Just to say a few words about the regulation, it's designed to discourage greenhouse gas emissions from ships. And this is defined as the release of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. The regulation sets very clear targets, and these targets are also progressive over time. They become more ambitious as the years go on. And Julian, in a moment, will explain how this is. The regulations is heavily in favour of renewable fuels of non-biological origin, although the EU does recognise that it needs to monitor whether enough RFNBOs are produced and whether they're at too high a price. Also, the regulation has a very strong moral ethic, you could say, underlying it. For example, Article 10 provides that if a biofuel is produced from a food crop, then it's deemed to have the same emission factor, that's penalty or cost, as the least favourable fossil fuel pathway for that type of fuel. So that's an express recognition by the EU. Although we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, this must not be at the price of food and the human need to have enough food to eat. Interestingly, also, the regulation, perhaps dissimilar from other regulations, gives the parties various options for how to be in compliance. So it's not just a question of comply or pay, or as with EU ETS, buying allowances, but instead the parties have freedom to either use alternative fuel energy sources, wind, solar, alternative fuels, or they can pay, or they can bank or borrow or pool any compliance surplus or deficit they may have. So there are a range of options that the regulation gives. And just to remind you before we start properly, the FuelEU Maritime Regulation is different both from IMO's EEXI and CII, which took effect from 1st of January 23. And those regulations focus on the ship's physical efficiency, and it measures CO2 per unit of transport work. And some of you may have seen West's webinar on EEXI and CII in February last year. It's also different, the FuelEU, from the EU ETS, the emissions trading system, which also requires ship owners, it relates to trading to, from, or in EU ports. But there, the obligation is to buy and surrender, as in spend, EU allowances. And again, as we'll see, the FuelEU regulation is different in that respect. So turning now to the webinar, our talk today will focus on it in three main sections. Firstly, Julien Rebaud, who is head of claims in our Singapore office, will give an overview of the FuelEU Maritime Regulation. And then Julien and I will discuss briefly some of the legal issues or topics or difficulties that might arise from the regulation. Following Julien and I, Anil Manipuza from West's Loss Prevention Department will speak about some of the issues and use of biofuels. Last but definitely not least, I'm very pleased to welcome today our external speaker, Hugo Wilson from Hecla Emissions Management. Hugo spoke to us at an in-house claims webinar seminar earlier this year on CII regulations, along with Kirsty McHardy from Stevenson Harwood. And Kirsty was kind enough to introduce us to Hugo for that seminar. And I thought that this would be a fantastic opportunity for us, as well as you, the audience, to hear about some of the solutions that have become available commercially in order where ships or users can make the use of the opportunity that the FuelEU Maritime Reg gives. So it allows parties to pool vessels, to bank, and to borrow compliance. And effectively, if you're operating a ship with a FuelEU compliance surplus, you can sell your surplus to other ships who may be in deficit and make a buck, as it were, make a profit that way, and hence the title about whether it's an opportunity to profit from the regulation. At the bottom of your screen, you should have a Q&A function. Please, if you could use that to put your questions to us, which we'll deal with at the end. And my colleague, Keely Edmondson, will be helping me to identify the questions and answer as many as we can at the end of the seminar. So I will now hand over to Julian Rebaud, who is our first speaker today. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Oops, what's happening here? That's it. A few technical problems. Good afternoon. I will be basically talking about the basic framework of FuelEU Maritime. Okay, so this year we saw EU ETS come into force on the 1st of January 2024. Next year will be on the 1st of January 2025, FuelEU Maritime will come into force. And the main three key objectives will be to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity used by ships. It will be the use of onshore power in the main European ports, and incentivize the uptake of renewable fuels and sustainable fuels. So what's the difference between EU ETS and FuelEU? Essentially, EU ETS is about the efficiency of the ship. So if you slow steam and your ship is efficient, you will emit less CO2, and therefore you will have to surrender less EUAs. FuelEU is all about the efficiency of the fuel. So we could just compare this to a power plant. If, for example, you're generating your electricity from coal, you will emit a lot of CO2. Now, if you transition to gas, you'll emit about 30% less CO2. And then if you go down to wind power, then you won't be emitting any CO2. And essentially, FuelEU is all about having a less carbon intensive fuel. Now, essentially, the EU takes the baseline of 91.16 grams of CO2 per megajoule as the baseline. And from the 1st of January 2025, ships on average will have to reduce that by 2%, which means that by the 1st of January 2025, on average over the year, ships will have to emit 89.34 grams of CO2 per megajoule or less to be compliant with the regulations. Now, this figure will reduce every 5 years. It'll be 6% from that baseline in 2030, all the way down to 80% by the 1st of January 2050. Now, just like with EU ETS, the scope of the rules apply to CO2, methane, and nitrogen oxide. And as well, same as with EU ETS, it will apply to any ships above 5,000 gross ton carrying cargo or passengers for commercial purposes. Similarly, with EU ETS, the regulated voyage applied to voyages where you load or unload cargo, or you embark or disembark passengers. And 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions will count when you stay in port, 100% as well between two ports in the EU, and 50% between a non-EU port and an EU port, or an EU port and an EU port in the utmost regions of the EU, such as in the Caribbean. So essentially the same framework as EU ETS. And again, just like EU ETS, there'll be a special regime for container ports, container ships. Essentially, they don't want ship owners to avoid the regulations by shipping all the cargo to a port outside of the EU, but very close to the EU, such as Felixstowe or Tangiers. Transship all the cargo, load it onto another ship to the EU, and essentially have a shorter voyage. So there'll be a list of ports outside of the EU, which will essentially count as if it was in the EU. And these ports will be all within 300 nautical mile of the EU of an EU port. and will have a share where Transship's TEU will exceed 65% of the total container trafficked. Now, we saw that the regulation applies to voyages where you load cargo or unload cargo and passengers as well. There are some excluded voyages or port calls, such as bunkering, obtaining supplies, crew change, dry docking, ships in need of assistance, ship-to-ship transfers outside the port limits, shelter from adverse weather, and search and rescue. So all these port calls will be excluded from the regulations. Just like with EUTS, the compliance obligation will be on the shipping company. And the shipping company is either the ship owner or the person with a responsibility with a document of compliance. However, unlike the EUTS, where actually the de facto position, the default position is that the ship owner will be the responsible party for compliance, with FuelEU, it will be the person, the document of compliance holder. So in many situations, it will be the technical manager. So how do you calculate the greenhouse gas intensity? Greenhouse gas intensity. Well, essentially, you'll look at your total reported fuel consumption, and then you'll put an emissions factor depending on the fuel that you have used. And the emission factor will be on the basis of a well-to-wake basis. Now, well-to-wake means that you don't only look at the emissions uh, uh, when you actually burn the fuel, you look at the emissions, the total emissions that were emitted to produce the fuel, to distribute it, and when you burn it. So that's called from well to wake. And each fuel will have a different factor. So, uh, for example, so in the regulations, all fuels will have an emissions factor in Annex 2 of the regulations. However, um, renewable fuels of non-biological origin and biofuels will also be able to use actual values as certified by the supplier. We'll talk about that later. Now, as you see, fossil fuels will not be compliant. Okay, for example, HFO, the well-to-wake, the well-to-wake factor, intensity factor will be 91.74 grams. So all these fuels, all these fossil fuels will not be compliant. Now, let's talk about renewable fuels of non-biological origin. So these are produced from renewable electricity and carbon capture. Okay, so these are, for example, e-diesels, e-methanol, e-energy. And in order to encourage the use of these fuels, there'll be a reward factor where the greenhouse gas intensity for the first 10 years will be halved. Now, let's talk about certification of fuels. This is very important for fuels of non-biological origin or low carbon fuels such as biofuels. Okay, these must be certified according to the EU Renewable Energy Directive. Okay, and fuel suppliers must be certified by and comply with this directive. If your fuel is certified, you can either use the default value in Annex 2 or the actual values certified by the supplier. If your fuel does not meet the requirements, then the default emission factor, you'll have to use a default emission factor corresponding to the least favorable fossil fuel pathway for each type of fuel. Okay. Now, for fossil fuels, it's easier. You just take the emission factor in Annex 2. Now, a timeline for implementation. So it's already started actually on the 31st of August this year. Each shipping company must submit a monitoring plan for their ships to the verifier. From the 1st of January, you'll have to start monitoring and recording data on an annual basis. On the 1st of January next year, 2026, you'll have to submit the ship's EU fuel report to the verifier. Then on the 31st of March 2026, you'll have to record the FuelEU report in a FuelEU database. And on the 30th of June 2026, the verifier shall issue a fuel document of compliance for the ship. Okay. And a ship must hold a valid FuelEU compliance document in order to enter, stay, or leave a port of a member state of the EU. So that's very important to have this compliance document. Now, the specificity of this regulation will mean that you'll be able to bank your compliance surplus. So, for example, we saw that you have to emit on average 89.35 grams of CO2 per megajoule. Now, if you only emit, let's say, 85 grams, you'll be on surplus, and you'll be able to bank the difference. So that's about 4 grams for the ship's compliance balance for the next reporting year. Okay, so that means that if for the next reporting year you are not compliant, you will be able to use that surplus to balance the non-compliance for the next year. Okay, but you can only bank for the next reporting period only. If you are non-compliant, you will be able to borrow an advanced compliance surplus for the next year. Okay. However, the amount required for the following reporting year to fulfill that deficit, there'll be basically a 10% interest on that. So you'll have the amount required for the following year will be multiplied by 1.1. Okay, and it won't be possible. This won't be possible if the compliance balance exceeds more than 2% of the threshold. And you cannot borrow for more than 2 consecutive running periods. Now, we've seen that you can bank and that you can borrow. You'll also be able to pool. So the compliance of 2 or more vessels can be pooled in order to balance the greenhouse gas intensity target. Okay, so the overperformance of one ship can be used to set off the underperformance of another ship. So, however, the overall pooling balance must be positive. Okay, you cannot have a pooling balance that's negative, as in non-compliance. The ship's pool can be controlled by different companies, and you can bank the surplus for the individual ship if the pool average has a compliance surplus. Now let's talk about penalties. Now, ships ships that are not compliant will have to pay a penalty proportional to their compliance deficit, and the compliance deficit essentially will be the actual greenhouse gas intensity less the required greenhouse gas intensity times the energy used, and the penalty will be 2,400 euros per ton of VLSFO energy equivalent. Okay, so it's equal to about 6 cents per megajoule of non-compliant energy. Now, if you are non-compliant, if you have a compliance deficit for more than 2 consecutive years, the penalty will be increased. And if you fail to present a FuelEU Maritime certificate of compliance, then your ship might be banned from the EU. And lastly, as I said at the beginning, the regulations will also encourage ships to use onshore power supply, and from the 1st of January 2030, regulated ships must connect to onshore power supplies in major European ports, and from 2035, all European ports with onshore power supplies. Okay, and this will apply to passenger ships and container ships of more than 5,000 gross tons. And that's it. This is a summary of the basic framework of FuelEU Maritime.
Great.
Any questions?
Well, thank you, Julian. I think we're going to deal with questions if possible at the end,
right,
in the Q&A session. But I just had a couple of questions for you, really, Julian.
Right.
I thought it'd be interesting to discuss. So obviously one of the questions might be from perhaps a ship owner saying, well, I've got a time charter that's going to stretch in beyond the 1st of January 2025. it might be a 2-year charter. We have no fuel EU clause in the charter party. Is that going to be a problem, or what problems might it raise? And I
Well,
don't know what
potentially
your
will be a
thoughts are.
problem for it will be a problem for owners because they won't be able to say that they're going to suffer a penalty and they can refuse. They won't be able to refuse to sell to the EU, for example, even if the fuel won't be compliant. Okay, it will be a legitimate voyage order, and so they will have to follow the charter's order to go to the EU and possibly suffer a penalty for going there with non-compliant fuel. And because there's no clause, potentially the owners won't be able to recoup any penalty that they suffer. They have to pay to the EU against the charterer.
Yeah, and presumably, I mean, there's the age-old implied indemnity that can be wheeled out in
So
cases when you're trying to
yeah,
get around or implied terms. Do you think there's room for implied term,
I,
first of
I,
all?
I, I really don't think there's any room for implied terms because, first of all, English law's views has a very restrictive view of implied terms, and it would have to be a risk that was not within the contemplation of the parties. And we know that FuelEU was going to come into force for a while now, and ignorance would not be a defense, and this should have been a contemplated risk. And if the parties chose not to deal with this issue, uh, then this you know the, there won't be an implied term.
Yeah. And also, I think some of the problem against implying a term would be that obviously going into EU ports and paying a penalty under the regulation doesn't deem that to be illegal or a
No,
criminal
exactly. So
act or anything like that. So
it,
it's
it
not as if by sailing to EU ports, charters are putting owners in breach of any regulation. It just costs them more.
It
So I
just
think that's
costs money,
probably, yeah,
exactly, and
yeah,
it will be a legitimate voyage order, so the owners will be obliged to go to the EU, and because it's not illegal to go to the EU with non-compliant fuel, you just have to pay a fine. So again, yes,
yeah.
possibly there won't be an indemnity against
And,
from the owners against the charterers for any
and, I,
potential fines.
and for the similar reason, it won't be frustrated because it's not radically
No,
different. It's just a bit more expensive.
it's
Yeah.
just more
Yeah.
expensive, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about when you mentioned a bit about bunkering? What do you think the parties, owners or charterers need to bear in mind when they're bunkering, what's from the 1st of
Yeah,
January?
so when they're bunkering, really, certification will be very important, as we saw in particular for renewable fuels of non-biological origin or even biofuels. Um, these need to abide by the RED regulation. So you'll need to have a supplier approved by the RED regulations, but also the fuels will have to be compliant, and all this will need to be certified. So uh, if ever you stem these type of bunkers, um, the certification, the bunker delivery note, and all that will have to provide all the required information
Yeah, and I
because
believe
your verifier will need all this information.
yeah, and BIMCO are issuing both a time charter clause, a ship manager contract
Mm,
clause, and also bunker supplier terms. I think it's promised certainly for the ship manager and the time charter clause will be available before the end of this year.
well, hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, fingers crossed. What about a voyage charter? Do you think there's going to be much difference for parties if they don't have a FuelEU Maritime clause in their voyage
No, I don't think
charter?
so. I mean, with a voyage charter, it's the owner that's responsible for stemming the fuel. So all I can see is that owners may apply a surcharge, but certainly if they haven't contemplated the a surcharge and they might incur a penalty, they certainly won't be able to claim some additional freight
Yeah.
for this again.
Yeah, and of course, if there is delay at a port that
Mm.
increases the compliance deficit, that will be compensated by demurrage.
Demurrage again,
Yeah,
yes.
and the eternal bliss. I don't think even if the demurrage, perhaps the demurrage rate isn't sufficient to compensate for the extra penalty. I don't know, but
Mm.
again, with the eternal bliss, unless owners can point to a separate breach by charterers, I think owners will be stuck with the freight and the demurrage. There's nothing.
Exactly.
It'd be very hard for them to introduce any new compensation unless they have a specific clause in their voyage charter, of course.
Yes.
And just very briefly before Anil begins, technical manager contracts, I think that's quite different as well,
Yeah.
because it's the
So these will be.
company who's liable. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So unlike with the EU ETS, where the default position is that the ship owner is the responsible company, the responsible party, here it's likely to be the DOC holder, which very often will be the technical manager. And so there'll two main things. The technical the owner will want to make sure the technical manager is complying with the monitoring and reporting obligations, but a technical manager is the one that's going to be facing the fines if the owner burns non-compliant fuel. So the technical manager will also want to be indemnified for any potential penalty that they face for for the ship having burnt non-compliant fuels.
Yeah, I was talking with one of our very large ship management members a couple of weeks ago at the board meeting, and he was saying they require their owners to pay into escrow, into deposit, the estimated amount of compliance deficit, the cost that will be for technical management, especially if, of course, if a ship owner changes technical manager, say on the 1st of December, the new technical manager is responsible for the whole year, not just for that month of December. So it's obviously very crucial, as between owners and technical managers, how they make their arrangements. Excellent, great. So I'm going to now hand over to Anil Menapuza, who will talk to us about biofuels. Thanks, Anil.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Julian. All right. So let me start with biofuels in the EU landscape. So what are biofuels? Biofuels means liquid fuels for the transport produced from biomasses such as the plant material, algae, other vegetable oils, animal waste, etc. But there has been as Nicolas said, there has been a directive from the RED that the biological biofuels need not come from the food or the fuel crops, and that all those biofuels will not qualify for the biofuels. So now, going straight into the biofuels, as per the marine standards or in the marine context, we have only two fuels which are tested and ready for the marine use. Those are basically the FAMEs, that are fatty acid methyl ester and hydrotreated vegetable oils. So what are this FAME of fatty acid methyl ester is commonly known as FAME, and HVO are the hydrotreated vegetable oils. So what is the FAME? FAME is produced by a process called transesterification, in which the plant oil or the animal fats are chemically treated with alcohol, usually methanol, and the reaction converts the triglycerides present in the oil or the fat into FAME biodiesel. As well as in the hydrotreatment vegetable oil, the hydrotreatment of saturates of the feedstock is done with hydrogen before conversion into the fatty acid. These are the basic difference between the hydrotreated vegetable oil as well as the FAME, the fatty acid methyl ester. So quickly going through the calorific values of both these fuels, we have that FAME is having a calorific value of around 37 megajoules per kilogram, whereas the hydrotreated vegetable oil is having a calorific value of 44 megajoules per kilogram. So what difference, or what is the significance of calorific value of the fuel? Which means, so like you can see the calorific value of diesel, marine diesel, or the diesel obtained from the fossil fuel is around 43 to 45 megajoules per kilogram. So when you consider the FAME, it is around 37 megajoules per kilogram. That means we need to burn more FAME to get the same amount of energy. So as per the CIMAC is the agency for International Council for Combustion of Engines. Their finding says that when we use biofuel of 100, B100, then we need to consume around 30% more fuel than the traditional fossil fuels, which means we need more volume of fuel to be stored on board, as well as more handling procedures of the fuel, and a lot of costs may go high in this case. But if you consider the hydrotreated vegetable oils, the calorific value is very similar to to the MGO, and it can be used, but the cost involved with hydrotreated vegetable oil is quite high. So what is the benefit of using both this fatty acid methyl esters and hydrotreated vegetable oils? Because now the latest ISO standards, that is ISO 8217 and 2024, has given the specifications. What properties you need? What are the minimum standards required by all the fuels available in the market? So this can be so that has standardized what is the a requirement for the fuels, so the fuel suppliers can give us the fuel. So both this, you can see both these drop-in fuels. These are the drop-in fuels because they are called drop-in. Why they are called drop-in fuels? Because FAME and HVO are ready to replace the fossil-based fuels and will not require any alteration on board or on board machineries. So carrying over, you can see that FAME has been covered by the ISO 8217 2024 table 1 in the DF grade table. The ULSFO and VLSFO and HFO containing the FAME has been mentioned in table 3 of the ISO 8217 2024 table, as well as the hydrotreated vegetable oil is known as the synthetic oil or green diesel or the paraffinic diesel is covered by the 8217 2024 table 1. So what are the typical properties of both these fuels? If we can see the typical properties, FAME is kind of a yellowish liquid, and it is low in sulfur dioxide and the particulate matters also biodegradable, and the density is roughly around the same as of distillate fuel, that is around 860 to 900 kilogram per meter cube at 15 degrees Celsius. Whereas the hydrotreated oil, if we can vegetable oil, you can see that it's a clear liquid. This is low on sulfur dioxide and particulate matter, and it is biodegradable. Whereas the density is also around 780 to 810 kilogram per meter cube at 15 degrees Celsius. Now we move on to another main. We can see this is a problem, or this is the concern regarding the biofuels. This is what is the oxidation stability. FAME, that is fatty acid methyl ester, can have significantly reduced oxidation stability. So what does oxidation stability means? The oxidation stability means over a period of time when oxygen comes in contact with the fuel, it tends to react with the fuel and changes the properties of the fuel. And eventually what happens? The stability of the fuel can be affected, causing the sludge formation, which eventually lead to filter blocking, then darkening, the acidity increases, microbial growth, etc. As oxidation stability value reduces, the other properties of like the total acid number, total base number, calorific value, cloud point viscosity, etc. get impaired. As a biofuel begins to lose the oxidation stability property, the acid number also will tends to increase, which turns the fuel into acidic and lead to the corrosion of the fuel, and corrosion starts place. But when you consider the hydro-treated vegetable oil, this is the better stability than the FAME, and it is similar to the traditional marine gas oil. All the ISO 8217 standards, recent standards, that is 2024, has specified the oxidation stability standards which all the fuel manufacturers need to adhere to. However, the degradation of the FAME is inevitable. So continuous monitoring, frequent visual inspection of the parts, etc., are the methods to be employed by the ship operators to prevent the oxidation of the fuels. Now moving into another property is the cold flow properties, which are very much important when you consider the fuel carried on board the ships. So what are the cold flow properties? So the cold flow properties for the FAME, that is the fatty acid methyl ester, is quite low. So the low tolerance to the cold temperatures than MgO, whereas the HVO is considered to be superior. So in this context, we need to consider few factors, that is the pour point, the cloud point, and the CFPP, that is the cold filter plugging points. So what does the pour point means? The pour point is the lowest temperature at which a liquid or a fuel ceases to flow. So in fuels, the pour point is largely dependent upon the petroleum wax content in the oil. So the pour point determines the minimum temperature required for the fuel to be stored and handled on board. So it is particularly important. So as the standards says that the fuel has to be kept at a minimum of temperature above 10 degrees Celsius. So that is the pour point of the fuel should be about 10 degrees Celsius. And similarly, what is the cloud point? Cloud point is also defined as a temperature of a liquid specimen when the smallest observable cluster of wax, the crystal wax, appears upon cooling under the prescribed conditions. So this is also particularly important while handling the fuel on board. And CFPP, that is the cold filter plugging point, is the lowest temperature at which a given volume of a fuel still passes through the standardized filtration device. So this is, and when it is cooled under certain conditions. So this is also particularly important when we are considering onboard operation and fuel handling procedures. So when it comes to the buyer perspective, or the ship, when on board the ship, we are very much interested on these three factors, which are clearly specified by the ISO 8217/2024 standards. But depending upon the trade of operation, where the ship is going, and where is the voyage is, all the buyer need to be wary of all these informations. So as I previously mentioned, since the FAME has get oxidized more quickly, it leads to the corrosivity of the fuel. So corrosivity can lead, the FAME can be corrosive onto various kinds of metals. It can be corrosive to copper, and it affects mainly the fuel injection components. As you can see in the pictures, this is something causing the corrosiveness of the fuel. But when we consider the hydrotreated vegetable oils, it's not so corrosive to copper or so then now we go to the microbial contamination, which is another aspect to be considered. So microbial action normally says that when the fuel get affected by bacteria, fungi, or yeast, etc. So normally microbial actions happens when the fuel is stored for a quite larger periods. This is the traditional fuels, fossil fuels like the diesels or the distillate fuels or the residual fuels can be affected by microbial attack for when you stand for a quite longer time. But FAME is hygroscopic. Hygroscopic means it has affinity to more water. It attracts more water, so it can when water comes into the fuel, it creates an ideal condition for microbial growth. So one thing to be considered for the FAME is that when you're keeping in a storage tanks or the water, draining of water becomes particularly very important in this perspective. Also, it kind of noticed that when this microbial growth tends to happen more at a particular temperatures, at higher temperature, the growth rapidly happens. So it is suggested to keep the fuel to be stored under a particular temperature in storage tanks, especially at a temperature of around 0 to 40 degrees Celsius. When we consider the hydrotreated vegetable oils, it is more similar to the traditional fossil fuels. Now we go to the material compatibility. So what are the materials we recommended when we are using the FAMEs? Recommended are the carbon steel, stainless steel, aluminum, nylon, Teflon, Viton, and fiberglass. Whereas other material which are not recommended are the brass, the bronze, copper, tin, zinc, etc. And neoprene, rubber, polyethylene, polypropylene, etc. So these are the parts, or these are the materials which get affected when we use FAMEs. So when the vessels consider to use in the biofuels like the FAME or the HVO, so when you consider with the manufacturer recommended to use take the recommendations, and if the material it depends upon the type of fuel you're using, like from the B7 to the B100, depending upon the blending of the fuels, we can depends upon the corrosivity and the material properties. So general safety and bunkering consideration. Both these fuels, like the FAME and the hydrotreated vegetable oils, are more similar to the fossil fuels. So there has been no general any other different specific bunkering instructions has been provided. The latest bunkering instructions provided by the European Maritime Safety Agency, EMSA, it was released last year in 2023 regarding the safe bunkering of biofuels. But the report found no specific standards or guidelines for the bunkering of HVO or FAME, owing because of its similar properties to fossil derived fuels. Also, the Port of Singapore, one of the major ports for bunkering, they also does not specify any particular additional requirement for bunkering of FAME or HVO. But to be considered that HVO, when in comparison with the FAME, has slightly more risk to the in persons. That is, prolonged exposure may lead to a skin dryness, cracking, or irritation. Inhalation of the vapor. So, if prolonged exposure can cause to little kind of irritation for the hydrotreated vegetable oils. But FAME it is kind of similar to traditional fuels. It is combustible, but not readily flammable. And it has a good solvent property. The solvent properties means it can wash away the sludges. So when we are taking bunkers, the tanks need to be prior cleaned before taking the fuel flame. But hydrotreated vegetable oil, it is flammable, and only the exposure is slightly in acid, corrosive. Avoid the prolonged exposure of the vapors. So what does the positives of this FAME? Let's go with the FAME first. So in the case of FAME, it is low sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and it is biodegradable. Good combustion properties, good compatibility with the distilled fuels and residual fuels. So we can blend it and use in different possible ways. So we have some blend of B7 to B100. So we can use in any ways. It has a good lubricity. One consider also cold flow properties, which can be improved by the use of additives. And the positives of hydrotreated vegetable oil is it is also low in sulfur dioxide, is biodegradable, and good combustion properties, good compatibility, energy density similar to distillate fuels, and storage stability is also in par with MGO. So both these fuels can be used in a conventional marine engine, which is without much major alteration to the engines, and so the cost involved is very less. So and the quality requirements are mostly covered by the 8217/2024 standards. So what are the areas of concerns? This is the storage. Again, even though the concern is the cold flow properties maybe require heating, the oxidation stability, the microbial activity, and the solvent properties. Again, when we come into the usage in the engines, it is a material compatibility, then the lubrication oils when we are using in the engines, and in some cases, additives used in the biofuels that can react with the SCR, that is the selective catalytic reduction used in for the NOx reductions, and it can cause some reduction in the effectiveness of SCR, which that has been observed now. So that comes to the end of the biofuels. With this, I conclude my part of the presentation, and I now invite Hugo Wilson from Hecla Emissions to start his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I will share my screen now. Good morning, everyone. My name is Hugo Wilson, speaking on behalf of Hecla Emissions Management. To give you a little bit of background before we get into it, Hecla is a joint venture company between the Affinity Shipbroking Group and the Wilhelmsen Group, based in Oslo. We were founded in 2023 as a cloud-based compliance and trading service for the EU ETS. We now manage over 1,000 ships across around 35 clients in each sector of the shipping industry. However, we are now focusing on the FuelEU Maritime, which is, as our previous presenters have explained, is far more complicated and involved than the EU ETS. We've heard that various fuels have different carbon intensity values that are then compared to a target. So on this graph, we've shown you where several of the fuels sit in comparison to the target. So you can see HFO, for example, is above the blue line, the greenhouse gas carbon intensity target set by the EU. As it is above the line, it is therefore in a compliance deficit. Likewise, the vessels that are using fuels that are below this line are in a compliance surplus. So you can see, for example, on LNG, the XDFs or the MEGI, so that is the two-stroke low-pressure engine and two-stroke high-pressure engine, are both below and are in compliance surplus for years to come. LPG, for example, is also in compliance surplus, and B30. And then right down at the bottom of the carbon intensity scale, we get green ammonia, B100, green methanol, biomethane, the fuels that are the ultimate end point for the FuelEU Maritime. As we've discussed, there are several ways to comply or not comply with the regulation. The first is that non-compliance results in a penalty. As Julian mentioned before, this penalty is then increased by 10% unless corrective action is taken. So this means that every year, 10% increase, and then we receive the extra decrease in carbon intensity in 2030. So it can quite quickly become very expensive. The other options for compliance are to borrow compliance balance from the following year. However, this comes effectively with a 10% interest rate. The next thing is that if you're on compliance surplus, you were able to bank that surplus. Now, we've had clarification from the EU on this, that it is possible to bank the compliance surplus indefinitely. But the most obvious way to comply is by pooling. So that is the combining of vessels, either intra-company or inter-company, and these can be any vessels, so that their average carbon intensity is below the target. And we'll get onto this in a second. What we can do here is we can see the penalty costs and the surplus values for various different fuels across both the EU ETS and the FuelEU. So you can see, for example, if you're using methanol that is made from natural gas, i.e. grey methanol, you'd be paying around 137 euros per tonne in EU ETS costs. This is assuming a 70% phase-in from EU ETS, i.e. next year, and 70 euros per EUA. So about 5 euros above where we are now. About 137 euros on EU ETS and about 261 euros on FuelEU Maritime. And this is because, as we've discussed before, this is a well-to-wake view of alternative fuels. And if you're using methanol used by created from natural gas, it has a very high carbon intensity. If you're looking at HFO, for example, it's a bit lower, about 30 euros compared to 153. LFO, MGO, then we have the different LNG engines as well. Now, the one thing to notice is that these FuelEU deficit prices are fixed until 2030, but the surplus value is going to be market-based. Here on the right-hand side, we've listed out the values of the different surplus, assuming a penalty price for those surplus. Now, in reality, the price paid for surplus will be dependent on the market and what people are being prepared to spend. So if we turn this into concrete examples and we take 3 ships, for example, so assume we take a dual fuel VLGC, which is burning LPG, a dual fuel Aframax, which can burn LNG, and an MR tanker, which can burn biofuel. If this VLGC is sailing on a 50% EU scope, i.e. inbound or outbound to the EU, so for example, US to Europe, if the VLGC is in fuel mode, it will be paying around $1,450 per day in FuelEU costs. However, if that same vessel is sailing on LPG, then its surplus, when valued at the penalty price, is around $8,000 per day. Likewise, on an Aframax, if it is burning HFO, it's around $1,000 per day. But if it's burning LNG, the surplus is around $5,700 a day. Again, on an MR tanker, if it's burning HFO, and we've assumed, for example, that the MR tanker is burning 25 tons of HFO equivalent per day, then it's around $700 a day. But if it's burning B30, so a biofuel that is eligible under the FuelEU Maritime, that is 30% pure biofuel, then the estimated value of the surplus is $4,515 a day. And you can see here, these are the greenhouse gas intensity values that we can assume for various fuels. These top two, this top one LPG is as in the directive. The LNG one is assuming a 2-stroke high pressure engine, so the MAN-MEGI engine, for example. And the B30 is based off a bunker delivery note that we've seen in the market in Rotterdam. However, it is likely that this B30 figure will change depending on the source of the feedstock. As Anil was saying, whether it's HVO or FAME, this is likely to change, and therefore the value of the surplus will change accordingly as well. But importantly, all of these well-to-wake values are below the 89.3 target, therefore they are all in surplus. Whereas the HFO at around 90 odd grams of CO2 per megajoule is very much in the deficit category. However, these deficit values are, although slightly difficult to calculate, they are real values. They will be paid by the technical manager to the member state at the end of the period. These surplus values here are purely theoretical. There is no, you cannot go to the EU at the end of the year with your low carbon intensity and cash it in for a check from the EU. These surpluses only have value if you are able to sell them to users who have a deficit. And this is why it creates a trading opportunity. However, there are a couple of problems with the trading of surplus. The first is that, as we've discussed, the ultimate responsible entity is the technical manager. However, as we know, the technical manager is not the entity which is choosing the fuel, setting the speed, or choosing where the vessel should sail. So it's very hard to reconcile the fact that this FuelEU Maritime Regulation is a regulation on exactly that, the fuel, and yet the responsible entity is not the one choosing the fuel. So this is a mismatch that we need to correct for in our commercial application of the regulation. The second issue is that the pooling, so the mechanism by which people can benefit from using alternative fuels, is slightly complex. The first issue with pooling is that vessels can only be included in one pool per year. Now, we've already seen charter party amendments being proposed, usually by charterers, that will say that the vessel should be included in the charterer's pool at the end of the period. But this doesn't work if the vessel has more than one charterer in a year. You then can't give it to one charterer because then the other charterer can't have it either. Equally, it's a problem if the charter period doesn't run from the 1st of January to the 31st of December. If it crosses over into the next reporting period, again, you come into that issue of, well, in whose pool does it sit? So this is a big issue, and we think that owners should be pushing back on charterers who are requesting that the vessel should be included in their pool, unless we're talking about multi-year charters, in which case then potentially there's an argument to do so. The other issue with pooling is that vessels can only be included in the pool if the total compliance balance is positive. So this means that if you have 3 ships that are all minus 5 tons of CO2 and 1 ship that is plus 16, then they can pool because the total balance is positive. But if you have 3 ships of minus 5 and you have a ship of plus 14, you cannot pool all of those ships together. One of them has to be left out. Now, this restricts trading and places risk on larger pools. It places risk as, well, we'll get into it now. The first thing is people often ask, what is a pool? Now, a pool is not a a pool that we're used to in shipping, a commercial pool. A pool is any two IMO numbers that are submitted to the database that are subject to the FuelEU Maritime. So these can be from any companies. They don't have to have a contractual relationship beforehand. They can be from any sector. So you could pool a ferry with an oil tanker, as long as both dock holders submit the relevant paperwork and the verifier then re-verifies the pool. Any ships will work in whatever combinations. This also means that very large pools come with risk. Because we have this issue of pools can only be pooled if the total compliance balance is positive, there is a risk that at the end of the year, if somebody has their data wrong, then the entire pool is void. Or if you make an agreement with someone at the start of the year to say, yes, we'll pool at the end, that only works if you know what your numbers are going to be. Because if you don't, and the total compliance balance is not positive, then you cannot pool. And it's an exercise that doesn't work. These risks are all multiplied the larger you make the pool. We already have a lot of counterparties in shipping, especially in this contractual chain. We have the technical manager, we have the ship owner, we have the charterer, we have the verifier. If we then multiply that out between all the different, if we try and make a large pool and multiply that out, it's a huge number of participants. And if one of them makes a mistake or is slow or incorrect, then the entire pool suffers as a result. And there is no mathematical advantage to creating a larger pool. A larger pool does not become greater than the sum of its parts. Moreover, there is no limit on the number of pools can create, as long as the two conditions are met. So one company can submit one pool of 10 or 5 pools of 2. And actually, this is where we believe the answer should be, that single surplus vessel pools should be the dominant type. So this means that with pooling, we think size matters. It's very easy to pool like this. We see that one vessel is creating surplus, and then we bring in deficit vessels until that surplus is used up. Then we have a look at another vessel, and again, we bring in deficit vessels until that entire vessel surplus is used up, and then it becomes a pool. This is much more manageable than trying to create these large pools that some companies are trying to look at or envisaging. You just create far more risk that if one person in here has got their numbers wrong, this whole pool becomes null and void. If we take it surplus vessel by surplus vessel, the whole process becomes a lot easier to manage. It also becomes much more interesting because it allows for the trading. So if you think, for example, we have one surplus vessel and it's created 200 tons of surplus, it knows once it includes deficit vessels into its pool, how much surplus it has remaining. So in this case, this vessel has 50 tons of surplus of available space left in its pool. This surplus can be evidenced by an emissions statement. Now we have DNV here only because we have a strategic partnership with DNV, but we're also integrated with ABS, Verifavia, we work with Lloyd's Register, etc. And you can use the emission statements from the verifier to determine how much surplus is available on a vessel. And then you can have a simple bilateral agreement with another company to bring in their deficit vessels into the slice of pool that they own and as evidenced by the verified emission statement. So these smaller pools are much more manageable and they facilitate the trading of surplus. What this also means from an owner's perspective is that if the charterer is looking for some sort of pooling rights on the vessel, but they've only used the vessel for a short period of time, then what the owner is able to provide the charterer with is a slice of that particular vessel's pool. and then it is up to the charterer to bring in deficit vessels into the slice that it owns, or to sell that slice to another party. So this is what we've created. We've launched the FuelEU Maritime Exchange, which works on the principles that we detailed in this presentation, that users of low carbon fuels can monetize their surplus by using verified emission statements and turning them into tradable assets, where the asset represents a stake in a particular vessel's pool. This also allows users of traditional fuels to buy into surplus to avoid penalties and become compliant. Although Anil gave a great presentation on the biofuel market, one of the grey areas over the biofuel market is the availability. Is it going to be widely available enough for the shipping industry, when actually the shipping industry is competing with all the other industries for this same biofuel? For example, the aviation industry, which is under even more pressure than shipping. If it is not the case that everyone can use biofuels, then the alternative is to buy surplus from companies who naturally have a compliant surplus on their books. For example, LNG, LPG, or the new dual fuel vessels. So this is an alternative to complying with the regulations, which doesn't involve the actual bunkering of new fuels. It's a paper exercise, effectively. So we've launched this exchange, we've signed up our first few customers, and we're very happy to take any questions on how trading works within the FuelEU Maritime. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugo. I think there's a lot of food for thought from those slides. I can see some questions have come in already. We've done quite well. Thank you very much to Julian and Anil and I who've been answering questions as we've been going. I think we've answered 21, with 11 still open. Several questions. I don't know, Hugo, if you've seen them on this pooling. Some requests your view. One question is, what are your expectations for the market price on surplus? I guess it says, do you think it will be relevant? Oh, I think from what you're saying, it will be relevant. How it's going to go up or down, I don't know. Do you have any views?
Yeah, so I think what will be bringing the price of surplus down is the availability and price of biofuels. If biofuels are widely available and at a decent price, then there's less incentive for people to have to buy into, say, an LNG surplus. And naturally, the LNG surplus will have to come down to make itself competitive with people using biofuels.
So supply and demand, basically.
Yeah, supply and demand of biofuels specifically will impact the price of surplus, in our view. People often talk about, well, the surplus has a price cap at the penalty. But actually, that's not strictly true, as we do have this 10% kicker if people are paying the penalty. So there is a little flexibility to the upside on the price. Currently, the deficit outweighs the surplus about 4-1 in the market. So my guess is that in the first few years, the surplus will trade pretty close, but a discount to the penalty price.
How big a discount? A nominal discount to the penalty price, more or less matching, but a bit cheaper, or quite a big discount?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the discount would be. None of the deals have been done yet because this doesn't exist yet. And the problem is there's such opacity in the biofuels market over available volumes, over what the bunkering contracts actually look like. Can you get reliable long-term contracts at decent prices? This is such an unknown in shipping at the moment that it makes it very difficult to, as you can imagine, sellers of the surplus want to sell at the penalty. buyers want to have buy
buyers.
at a discount, but they don't have much to rely on unless there is more transparency in the biofuel market to counteract it.
Okay, so it sounds as though perhaps in the short term, whilst the companies are getting used to these regulations, perhaps there'll be more demand to pool if it's seen as an easier way to comply or not to pay a penalty compared to using alternative fuels when you've got unreliability or unknowns about the price and the terms of biofuels.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what some people are imagining, that people will be willing to pay a bit extra for the certainty and the ease. Buying somebody else's surplus is a much easier exercise than establishing new bunkering contracts and bunkering the ship with biofuels and doing all the paperwork associated.
And you can put it as an OPEX cost, presumably, quite fairly easily for that reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Excellent. So just looking through some of the other questions, we've run over the hour already, so I won't do too much. As I say, Keely Edmondson is doing, looking at all the questions. We'll be logging them and trying to answer as many afterwards. One question here, I think we'll probably make this the last one, also on pooling, Hugo, I hope you don't mind, is how can you know what your numbers will be for the pool when you don't know what voyages will be performed during the year? So I'm not sure if that's from a pool surplus vessel or a pool deficit vessel.
So this is why you don't want to commit yourself to intercompany pooling arrangements before you know, because you don't know what your numbers are going to be, and if you get them wrong, you can't pool. What you can do with a degree of certainty is use the emission statements that are generated after the voyage. So you can use from people like DNV and ABS the compliance balance statements that will be generated after the voyage, and you will know that on that voyage you created this amount of surplus. So you do it voyage by voyage is the way to do it.
Yeah, and also, of course, depends what Europe, this only applies to EU ports. So obviously you've got to bear in mind in your schedule what your trading pattern of your ship's going to be. So it's a further analysis to be done.
That's why, yeah, doing it after the voyage is after an EU voyage, getting the compliance balance statement from the verifier. We're in good time, so most of them can do it within a few days of the voyage, and then you know what you're playing with, and you know whether you want to sell it, use it internally, etc.
Excellent. Okay, excellent. Thank you for that, Hugo. Thank you for everybody. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our audience as well for joining us and asking lots of questions for us to get our teeth into. Thank you. I will now share my slide with the last slide, which is really just to show you that a recording of the webinar will be available on the West YouTube channel. Also, we have started opening a new shipping and the environment part of our website, a whole page, which is really aimed to collect various articles, links, information, recordings of videos, all on these FuelEU regulations, EU ETS, all these related regulations, and also environmental articles as well outside the EU regulations. You'll see there are two email addresses, claimsecoregs@westpandy.com. This is a group email for the 5 of us at the moment, so 4 claims handlers, myself, Julian, Keely, and Melanie, and then Dimitri from our loss prevention department, who will aim to answer any questions relating to, I've said, eco-regs, FuelEU, EU ETS, or alternatively, of course, to Hugo if you have any specific questions relating to the pooling and his presentation today. So all that remains for me to do is thank you again very much for joining us today. And if you have any suggestions or comments, please do email them to the Claimed Eco Regs email address. Thanks very much.